Every nanny fled, terrified, each departure marked by escalating chaos and inexplicable accidents. But the real horror wasn't the destruction. It was the unsettling calm of my 3 children as they silently watched our home unravel. The front door slammed with the force of a thunderclap, the sound echoing through the cavernous halls of a home that had become far too big for me. It was the 6th time in 8 months I'd heard that sound. Another nanny, another failure. I stood in the doorway of the playroom, a bone-deep weariness settling over me. Before me was a scene of utter carnage. Toys, books, and shredded cushions formed a multicolored mountain range across the expensive Persian rug. And in the center of it all, my 3 6-year-olds, Leo, Max, and Chloe, stood perfectly still, their identical blue eyes fixed on me. They weren't crying. They weren't smiling. They were just watching. They had been a blessing, a miracle my late wife Amelia and I had never thought possible. But since she passed 2 years ago, that blessing had twisted into a challenge that was slowly breaking me. They weren't just energetic, they were a force of nature, a 3-person hurricane that tore through every attempt I made to bring order to our lives. Nannies came in, bright-eyed and full of textbook theories on child-rearing, and they left, pale-faced and trembling, usually within a month. Nanny number 4, a sweet girl named Jessica, left with a broken ankle after tripping over a toy car that she swore hadn't been there a second before. Nanny number 5, a stern, ex-military woman named Brenda, fled in the middle of the night after a small, inexplicable fire started in the kitchen wastebasket while the triplets were supposedly asleep in their beds upstairs. And the latest one, Martha, a woman with 30 years of experience, had just run out screaming about the devil's children after the dining room chandelier, a 200-pound monstrosity of crystal and brass, had inexplicably detached from the ceiling and crashed onto the table just moments after she'd stepped away to get a glass of water. The triplets had been in the room, silently watching from a corner, completely unharmed. They were always unharmed. They were the eye of their own storm. The agencies were starting to blacklist me. They called my children unmanageable, a danger to staff. I tried to defend them. I told them they were just grieving, that they were acting out. They were spirited. But even I was beginning to doubt my own words. There was a strangeness to their chaos, a bizarre synchronicity that defied logic. They rarely spoke to each other, but they moved as one. If Max decided to upend a can of paint, Leo and Chloe would appear with brushes as if summoned, all 3 painting the exact same disturbing, abstract patterns on the walls. They shared a silent language that excluded the rest of the world, and it was a language that terrified people. Mr. Allister, the voice on the phone, was tight with strained professionalism. It was Mrs. Gable from the last reputable nanny agency in the city. "I'm sorry, but after Martha's report we can no longer in good conscience place anyone in your home. The liability is simply too great." Desperation clawed at my throat. I was a surgeon. I had lives in my hands every day, but I couldn't manage my own 3 children. "Please," I begged, my voice cracking. "There has to be someone. Anyone." There was a long pause. I could hear her shuffling papers. "There is one possibility," she said, her tone hesitant. "She's not a nanny. We have her on our books for housekeeping, but her references are unique. They all mention her calming presence in difficult homes. She's older, and she specifically requested a challenging placement." "I'll take her," I said, without a second's thought. "What's her name?" "Ilara," Mrs. Gable replied. "She can start tomorrow." The next day, I was on edge. The house was a disaster from Martha's hasty departure, and the subsequent rampage from the triplets. I'd managed to get them into their playroom, but a tense, humming silence had fallen over the house, which was somehow more unnerving than their usual noise. The doorbell rang precisely at 9 a.m. I opened it to a woman who was not what I expected. Ilara was probably in her late 60s, with kind eyes etched with wrinkles and a serene smile. Her gray hair was tied in a neat bun, and she wore a simple, clean dress. She didn't look like she could handle a mild-mannered poodle, let alone my trio. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the grand, disheveled foyer. She didn't flinch. She simply took a slow, deep breath, as if tasting the air. "It's heavy in here," she said softly, her voice like calming balm. "The sorrow." Before I could respond, a tremendous crash echoed from the living room. My heart leapt into my throat. I sprinted down the hall, Alara following at a surprisingly brisk pace. I burst into the room to see the triplets standing on a chair they'd pushed against the wall. Together they were trying to pull down the large, ornate portrait of Amelia that hung above the fireplace. It was my most treasured possession, the last thing I had of her smiling face. "No!" I yelled, a surge of anger and grief washing over me. "Get down from there! What are you doing?" They ignored me, their small hands straining against the heavy gold frame. It was tipping, about to fall and shatter. I started forward, ready to grab them, to scream, to do something. But Alara put a gentle hand on my arm, stopping me. Her touch was firm, yet calming. I looked at her, confused and furious. But her eyes weren't on the children. They were fixed on the painting, and her face was ashen. Her serene expression was gone, replaced by one of dawning, absolute horror. She took a step into the room, her voice a barely audible whisper, not to me, but to the chaos itself. "My God," she breathed, her eyes wide with a terrifying understanding. "They're not trying to break it." She finally turned to look at me, her gaze piercing, and in that moment the entire world tilted on its axis. "They're trying to protect you from what's behind it." "Protect me from what?" I snapped, the adrenaline and frustration making my voice harsh. "It's a wall, Alara. There's nothing behind it but plaster and wood." I took a step towards the teetering children, my patience completely gone. "Leo, Max, Chloe, get down from there this instant. You will break your mothers." The frame groaned, a final, tortured sound of stressed wood. Then, with a collective grunt from the triplets, the painting tore free from its wire. It didn't just fall, it flew outwards, as if pushed by an unseen force. I instinctively threw an arm up to shield my face as the 200-pound frame, portrait, and glass crashed onto the marble hearthstone below. The sound was a deafening explosion of shattering glass and splintering wood. The room seemed to shudder from the impact. Shards of glass sprayed across the rug like crystalline shrapnel. The children tumbled from the chair, landing in a soft, practiced heap on a nearby cushion, completely unscathed. The silence that followed the crash was more profound, more absolute than any quiet I had ever experienced in this house. For a moment, nobody moved. My heart hammered against my ribs, my breath caught in my chest. My wife's smiling face was gone, obliterated, replaced by a spiderweb of cracks and a gaping hole where her kind eyes used to be. A fresh wave of grief, sharp and violent, stabbed through me. I turned on my children, an incoherent roar of anguish and fury building in my throat. But the words died before they could form. The triplets weren't looking at me. They hadn't even glanced at the destruction they'd caused. All 6 of their identical blue eyes were fixed on the now bare space on the wall where the portrait had hung for 8 years. I followed their gaze, my anger slowly being replaced by a cold, prickling unease. The wallpaper was peeling away in a large circular patch, as if it had been blistered by some intense localized heat. And underneath, on the stark white plaster, was a stain. It wasn't a water stain. It was a deep, unsettling black, like a pool of ink that had soaked into the very fabric of the house. It was a jagged, ugly shape, and as I stared at it, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft from the now broken window panes. The air around it felt cold, stagnant, dead. "What is that?" I whispered, taking a hesitant step closer. It looked like some kind of aggressive mold, but there was no source of moisture, and it had an almost oily sheen to it. It seemed to pulse faintly in the light. A trick of the eyes, I told myself. It had to be. "It is why they fear this room," Ilara said, her voice steady and low beside me. "It is why the nannies do not last. It is why things fall, and things break." I tore my eyes away from the grotesque blotch on the wall to look at her. "It's mold. A bad leak behind the wall, that's all. I'll have a contractor in here tomorrow." I was a man of science, of tangible evidence and provable theories. I clung to the logical explanation like a drowning man to a raft. Ilara shook her head slowly, her gaze never leaving the stain. "Does mold throw chandeliers, Mr. Alistair? Does it place a toy car at the top of the stairs? Does it start fires in wastebaskets?" Her questions hung in the air, each one a hammer blow against my fortress of rationality. I remembered Jessica's insistence that the toy car had just appeared. Brenda's terrified babbling about the fire starting from nothing. The chandelier? The inspector had found no fault with the wiring or the chain. He'd called it a 1 in a million structural failure. But what if it wasn't? I looked back at my children. They were huddled together now, their small bodies forming a tight circle. For the first time since the crash, they seemed relaxed, the ever-present tension in their shoulders gone. They had won. They had exposed the enemy. "They feel it," Ilara continued, her voice a soft murmur. "Children, especially these three. They are more open, more sensitive. They don't have our adult walls of disbelief. While you have been mourning your wife, something else has been feeding on that sorrow. It has been growing in the heart of your home, hiding behind the face of your happiest memory." My mind reeled. It was insane. It was the stuff of cheap horror novels, not the reality of my life. Yet, I couldn't deny the cold spot in the room. I couldn't deny the unnatural stillness that had followed years of unexplainable chaos. I walked to the wall, my hand outstretched. My fingertips, trained to detect the most subtle of human ailments, hesitated just an inch from the blackness. The cold intensified, seeping into my bones. It felt ancient and malevolent. "All this time," I said, my voice thick with a dawning, sickening realization. "All their tantrums, all the destruction. They weren't attacking us." "No," Ilara confirmed. "They were fighting back. It was the only way they knew how. They were making noise to scare it, breaking things it focused on, creating chaos to disrupt its influence. They have been protecting this family since their mother passed. That is their gift." The word gift hung in the air, redefining everything I thought I knew about my children. They weren't wild. They were warriors. My 3 little warriors. A profound sense of shame and love washed over me. I had been scolding them for their courage. I finally let my fingers touch the edge of the stain. The plaster was ice cold and felt strangely soft, almost spongy. I pulled my hand back as if burned. As I stared, transfixed by the unnatural darkness, I noticed something impossible. An oily black tendril, no thicker than a piece of thread, was slowly, almost imperceptibly, creeping outwards from the main mass, slithering across the clean white plaster. It was moving. It was growing. Right before my eyes. My blood ran cold. "Ilara," I choked out, unable to tear my gaze away. It's getting bigger." She stepped closer, her kind face now a grim mask of resolve. "Of course it is," she said, her voice dropping to a chilling whisper that cut through the silence of the room. "We've torn down its hiding place. It knows we can see it now. And it's furious." The black tendril pulsed, extending another millimeter across the plaster. It was a deliberate, predatory movement that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. "Furious?" I repeated, my voice tight with a fear I hadn't felt since I'd held my wife's hand for the last time. "What is it?" Ilara didn't answer immediately. She walked over to the huddle of children, who watched the wall with an unnerving, focused calm. She knelt before them, not as an adult to a child, but as an equal. "You were very brave," she said softly. "You showed us. Now I need you to go to the kitchen. Can you do that for me? Stay together, and wait there." Leo, who I'd always thought of as the ringleader, nodded once, his small face serious. Without a word he took Max and Chloe's hands, and the 3 of them filed out of the room, their retreat as synchronized and silent as their attack had been. They didn't look back. The trust they placed in this woman they'd met only an hour ago was absolute. It was a trust I realized I had never earned. When they were gone, Ilara rose and turned back to me. "What you call it doesn't matter," she said, her eyes fixed on the creeping stain. "Some call it an echo, a residue. It is a concentration of profound grief and pain that has curdled. It congeals in a place, feeds on negative emotion, and becomes something semi-sentient, something hungry. Your grief over your wife's passing was the seed. This house, full of love and now full of sorrow, was the fertile ground, and your children, with their unique sensitivity, have been its primary target and its staunchest opposition. My surgeon's mind desperately sought a foothold in logic, a psychic mold, an emotional parasite. Elara, that sounds impossible, she finished for me. Look at the wall, Mr. Alistair. You are a man of medicine. You trust what you can observe. Observe. I did. The stain was visibly larger now, the edges feathering out into the plaster. A faint, cloying odor, like damp soil and spoiled meat, began to permeate the room. It was subtle, but undeniable. The cold spot was expanding, a palpable dome of icy pressure that made my teeth ache. This wasn't a hallucination. This was real. Why the nannies? I asked, my voice a hoarse whisper. Why drive them away? Because they brought order, Elara explained. They brought rules and cheerfulness and structure. They were an invading force of positivity. It couldn't tolerate that. It thrives on chaos, misery, and fear. The same emotions it provoked in your children, it twisted and used to lash out. It used their own energy against your attempts to heal. The chandelier, the fire, that was not your children's power. That was this thing, amplified through them. A sickening realization dawned on me. The nannies hadn't feared my triplets. They had feared the entity that wore my children's chaos like a cloak. And I, in my blindness, had blamed my own children for the darkness that was consuming our home. How do we fight it? I asked, a new resolve hardening in my voice. I was a doctor. I fought disease. This was just another, more esoteric kind of sickness. Do I call a priest? An exorcist? Elara gave a small, sad smile. That would be like trying to perform surgery with a sledgehammer. This is not a demon to be cast out. It is a wound in the fabric of your home and your family. And you do not heal a wound by attacking it. You clean it and you fill it with light. She walked to the shattered fireplace and knelt, carefully picking up one of the largest remaining pieces of the portrait. It was the section showing Amelia's hand, the one wearing her wedding ring. Elara handled it with a reverence that shamed my earlier anger. This was its shield, she said, holding the piece of canvas. It hid behind your most cherished memory. It used your love for her to anchor itself. So we will use that same love to drive it out. She looked at me, her gaze clear and unwavering. Mr. Alistair, your children have been fighting a war for 2 years. Now, it's our turn to stand on the front lines. I need you to get a bucket, warm water, salt, and every candle you can find in this house. I didn't question her. For the first time in 2 years, I had a direction, a purpose beyond simply surviving the day. I ran from the room, my feet pounding on the hardwood floors, gathering the strange list of supplies. As I worked, I could hear Elara's voice from the living room, not speaking but humming. It was a low, melodic, and strangely ancient-sounding tune. It wasn't loud, but it seemed to fill the house, pushing back against the encroaching silence. I returned with a sloshing bucket, a canister of sea salt, and an armful of candles of all shapes and sizes. The living room had changed. The cloying smell was stronger, and the stain on the wall was now the size of a dinner plate. The black tendrils were spreading faster, like veins of poison. Elara took the bucket. Good, she said, her voice calm despite the palpable wrongness in the air. Now light the candles. Place them all around the room. Make a circle of light. Us. My hands trembled as I lit the first candle, the small flame a defiant spark against the gloom. One by one, I lit them all, placing them on tables, on the mantelpiece, on the floor, until the room was bathed in a warm, flickering glow. The shadows danced, and for a moment the black stain seemed to recoil, its edges sharpening as if in pain. Elara poured a generous amount of salt into the bucket of water, stirring it with her hand. The humming grew louder, resonating in my chest. She walked to the wall, holding the bucket of salted water like a sacrament. She dipped a clean rag into the water and wrung it out. It will fight back, she warned, her eyes never leaving the pulsing blackness. When I touch it, it will be angry. It will use the house, it will use your fears. Do not let it distract you. Keep the children safe. No matter what you hear, no matter what you see, do not come back into this room until I call for you. Do you understand? I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. She took a deep breath, and then she pressed the salt-soaked rag against the heart of the stain. The moment the rag made contact, the house screamed. It wasn't a sound made of air and vibration. It was a psychic shriek that pierced my skull. Every light bulb in the house exploded in a shower of sparks. The candles I had just lit were all extinguished at once, plunging the room into a terrifying darkness broken only by the dim light from the foyer. A gale-force wind erupted from the wall, tearing through the room, sending papers and glass and shattered picture frames flying. Through the maelstrom, I could see Ilara, braced against the wall, her arm pressed against the stain, her body a frail silhouette against an unseen hurricane. Then, above the roar of the wind, I heard it. A sound that froze my blood. It was Amelia's voice, crying. It came from upstairs, from our old bedroom. Clear as day, she was sobbing my name. "David! David, help me! It's so cold!" My heart shattered. It couldn't be, but it sounded so real, so full of pain. My body turned towards the stairs, every instinct screaming to run to her, to save her. "It's a lie!" Ilara's voice strained against the phantom wind. "It's using your memory. Stay focused. The children." But then I heard another sound, the pitter-patter of small feet from the kitchen, and Chloe's terrified cry. "Daddy, Mommy's crying. She needs us." My world fractured into two impossible choices. Logic, Ilara's warning, the very real chaos erupting from the wall. It all screamed that the voice was a trick. But the sound of my late wife's sobs, followed by the terrified cry of my own daughter, bypassed my brain and tore directly into my soul. It was a perfectly engineered attack, using my deepest love and my greatest loss as weapons. For a heartbeat I was paralyzed, torn between the old woman fighting an invisible war in the living room and the ghostly plea from upstairs. "Daddy!" Chloe's voice came again, closer this time, laced with panic. "We have to help Mommy." That was the catalyst. The entity was not just targeting me. It was using my wife's memory to lure my children towards it. A white-hot protective fury surged through me, eclipsing the grief and fear. I spun away from the staircase and sprinted towards the kitchen. I found them huddled in the doorway, their small faces pale, tears streaming down Max and Chloe's cheeks. Only Leo stood firm, his little fists clenched, his blue eyes narrowed not at the sounds from upstairs, but at the raging storm in the living room. He knew. He had always known where the real monster was. "Stay behind me," I commanded, my voice a low growl I didn't recognize. I scooped Chloe into one arm and grabbed Max's hand with the other, pulling them back from the doorway. "Leo, come on." He didn't move, his gaze still locked on Ilara, who was now being forced back step by step by the sheer force of the invisible pressure from the wall. The stain was boiling, writhing like a nest of black snakes. "It's a trick," I shouted to my children over the din. "That's not Mommy. It's the bad thing in the wall, and it's lying to us." Hearing the words spoken aloud, naming the deception, seemed to break the spell. Chloe buried her face in my shoulder, her sobs quieting. Max squeezed my hand, his knuckles white. Leo finally broke his stare and ran to my side, grabbing my trouser leg. We were a unit, a family, and we were not going to be broken. I herded them further down the hall, away from the living room, putting my body between them and the psychic onslaught. The phantom wind howled, rattling the very foundations of the house. A vase on a hallway table exploded. The lights flickered violently, casting strobe-like shadows that danced like specters. Amelia's voice cried out one last time, a desperate fading wail that almost broke my resolve. But I gritted my teeth, holding my children tighter. "Ilara needs our help," Leo said, his small voice cutting through the noise with surprising clarity. He wasn't looking at me, but at his siblings. "We have to help her." Before I could stop him, he let go of my leg. Max and Chloe looked at him, then at each other. A silent, instantaneous communication passed between them. It was the same unsettling synchronicity that had always unnerved me, but now, for the first time, I saw it for what it was. Not a strangeness to be feared, but a connection to be trusted. "What are you doing?" I asked, my own fear spiking. They didn't answer me. Instead, they joined hands, forming a small, tight circle in the middle of the hallway. They closed their eyes. The chaotic energy that usually erupted outwards from them in the form of tantrums and destruction was now being drawn inwards. I could feel it. The very air around them grew still and heavy, a pocket of calm in the raging storm. They began to hum. It wasn't the melodic tune Ilara had been humming. It was a single, pure, resonant note, a perfect harmony. The note grew in strength, vibrating through the floorboards, through the soles of my feet, and into my bones. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated, childish love. It was the memory of their mother's lullabies, the joy of a shared secret, the fierce, unspoken loyalty of siblings. It was everything the entity in the wall was not. In the living room, the gale began to subside. The psychic shriek faltered, replaced by a low, guttural hiss, like steam escaping a ruptured pipe. Through the doorway, I saw Ilara find her footing. She looked down the hall at us, her eyes wide with astonishment and dawning reverence. She gave me a sharp nod, a look that said, "Now." She turned back to the wall and pushed with all her might. The humming from my children swelled, a wave of palpable energy that flowed past me and into the living room. The black stain recoiled violently from Ilara's saltwater rag. It shrank, its tendrils retracting as if burned. With a final agonizing groan that seemed to come from the house itself, the blackness imploded, vanishing from the plaster with a faint pop, leaving behind nothing but a clean, white, circular patch that looked almost bleached. Silence. Absolute peaceful silence. The wind was gone. The cold was gone. The smell of decay was gone. The only sound was the gentle, fading hum from my 3 children, who slowly opened their eyes and let go of each other's hands, looking utterly exhausted but serene. I rushed back into the living room. Ilara was leaning against the wall, breathing heavily, but a triumphant smile graced her lips. The room was a disaster zone of broken glass and upturned furniture, but it felt clean, lighter. The oppressive weight that had choked this house for 2 years had finally lifted. "They did it," she breathed, looking at the triplets with wonder. "Their gift. It isn't just seeing or feeling the darkness, it's creating the light. Together they are a beacon." I knelt down and pulled all 3 of them into a hug, burying my face in their hair. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, tears of shame and gratitude streaming down my face. "I'm so sorry I didn't understand." Leo patted my back with his small hand. Chloe hugged my neck tightly. Max simply leaned against me, his small body finally relaxed in my arms. We stayed like that for a long time, a broken family slowly piecing itself back together in the wreckage of our battlefield. In the weeks that followed, the house transformed. Ilara stayed on, not as a maid or a nanny, but as a part of our family, a wise elder who understood the language of my children better than I ever could. With her guidance, I began to learn it too. We painted the living room a bright, sunny yellow. The triplets helped, their painting no longer abstract and disturbing, but full of color and life. We didn't replace Amelia's portrait. Instead, we filled the wall with dozens of smaller pictures of all of us, Amelia, me, and the 3 incredible children who had been her greatest gift. The chaos didn't vanish entirely, but it changed. It was no longer a desperate defense. It was just the normal, messy, wonderful chaos of 3 happy, energetic 6-year-olds. They still moved with an uncanny understanding of each other, but now they let me into their silent world. Their gift hadn't gone away. It had simply settled, no longer needed as a weapon. Now it was just a quiet strength, a bond that I finally understood and cherished. The agency stopped calling, and for that, I was grateful. We didn't need a nanny. We just needed each other, and the quiet, smiling woman who had seen the warriors hiding inside my wild, wonderful children.